So welcome everyone who's made it from all over the world at different times, some very inconvenient. Apologize for that. Welcome to this session. The session is called Diverse Economies in Modern Human Worlds, Moving Beyond Anthropocentric Thinking and Doing. My name is Carlotta, and I've put together this session with the help of our contributors today, with the aim of exploring and discussing some of the ways in which we can bring modern human perspectives into diverse and community economy thinking and doing. We have quite a tight schedule, just because we'd like to have plenty of time for discussion, collective discussions. So I wanted to briefly introduce maybe the program ahead of us. I'm not sure about doing introduction because there is 20 of us. Perhaps we could all introduce ourselves when we want to speak, ask questions, maybe. Just a brief introduction, names, and where you find yourself at this time and your area of interest or work of interest. As for the programs for this evening, we'll have 6 short presentations in total, divided into 2 slots, and plenty of time for discussion. We'll first hear 3 short presentations of 5 minutes each from Ethan, Nikolai, and myself, and they'll be followed by a discussion. The first slot of presentation is going to be a little bit more theoretical interventions, thinking about the way that we can think about the economy in modern human terms. And we'll have a discussion with chaired by Elizabeth after the first 3 presentations, after which we'll have a short 5 minutes break at the turn of the hour, basically. And when we come back, we'll hear another 3 presentations from Bethany, Jane first, Bethany, Alison, and Ignacio about their work and experiences of doing the economy through the cultivation of subjectivities and communities. And then we'll have another discussion chaired by Elizabeth, and we'll wrap up at around 5 minutes to the hour. I just wanted to remind everyone that the session is being recorded. Maybe I should put up the Liviana slides that they've kindly passed on, just quickly, so I don't have to. Can you all see this? Yeah, so the session is being recorded, but also feel free to write questions or comments in the chat about the session, and we'll make sure to pick them up in our discussion. I also wanted to let everybody know that Alison is going to be our CEI liaison, meaning that she'll be providing a link between the Community Economy Institute and the audience. And also, I'll be keeping times during this session, and I'll signal contributors when there is 1 minute left to the presentation, if that's okay. So yeah, it's 6 minutes past. I guess we could start. First, it's Ethan. Ethan, if you want to, I'll be keeping time and I'll signal 1 minute.
Great, thank you. Well, it's great to be here with everybody. My name is Ethan Miller, he, him pronouns, and I'm calling in from Wabanaki, Maine. Wabanaki homelands here in what is colonially known as the USA. And I work, I'm a farmer, I grow fruit trees. I also work for Land in Common Community Land Trust, doing land justice work. And then my academic work at this point is kind of like burning the midnight oil in order to do some theoretical theoretical exploration in addition to all the other work. But it's really great to get to be here with y'all and have this conversation. So I think we have a very short time, so I'm just going to give like kind of a really quick snapshot of a few ways that I'm trying to explore thinking livelihoods beyond anthropocentric frameworks. And for me, let me share my screen here, share some slides. Can everybody see that? So for me, a starting point is thinking about what I call the hegemonic trio as a core obstacle to thinking beyond anthropocentrism, to really thinking about our more than human interdependencies. I see these three categories that are just so familiar, probably to all of us, that they're almost common sense, and we use them all the time. We think with them all the time. We use them in our analyses of things. Historians use them to talk about things, stretching way back in the past. But the reality is that these are colonial constructs that emerged in Europe really over the course of the 18th century, not really consolidated even until the 20th century in their current form. And I think so. I engage with these a lot in my book, Reimagining Livelihoods. So I'm not going to say a whole lot about that, but I really see these three categories as sort of forms of modern alienation, forms of colonial alienation, the economy as kind of the alienated form of our life-sustaining labor, society as the alienated form of our relations with each other, environment, the alienated form of our interdependence with our more than human relatives. And so I see these categories as really slicing up our interdependencies in ways that make them very, very hard to think, very hard to encounter, very hard to engage with. So for me, it feels like a real priority to try and think outside these categories. So I think what I'm trying to do conceptually is really like what I think of as kind of speculative nonfiction. Like, if we were going to abandon these categories, what other kinds of concepts might we need in order to think about our livelihoods and our interdependencies, in ways that still gave us some really fine-grained categories to do analysis and understand dynamics. So I begin with the category of the concept of livelihoods. What I'm sharing here is a very complicated diagram that I've been working on for many years. I'm not in any way going to go into all the details of it. I'm happy to share this with people. I'm in the process of trying to write about it in a way that I can share more widely. But I'm just going to pick out a few key pieces of this. I like the phrase livelihoods because it's really a way of starting from practice. I think when you start with livelihoods, we're always present to our interdependencies. We're not cutting things up into the dominant categories. And so for me, at the center of this diagram is what I call the livelihoods triad, which is really a way of thinking about kind of it's kind of a starting point, or it's like the volatile molecule of the whole framework. It's the three relationships of making a living, of being made by others, and also being unmade by others. That is receiving a living from others, and then making a living for others, or perhaps unmaking others in the case of eating. And so to me, this really forms like a key nexus for thinking about livelihoods outside of economy. And then, so if you imagine that as sort of like one way to think of it is almost like a body with outstretched arms, which I realize is a very anthropocentric way to think about it, but it could also be a tree with roots if you flip it upside down. But in between those two arms, on one hand, receiving a living, and on the other hand, offering a living. And offering a living, I mean, think about like we die and we become compost. That's kind of like in some ways, the ultimate example. If you add time, that really becomes what we inherit, and then what our legacy is when we move on. And in between that is where I think about the category of creation. And for me, if we start with creation, instead of like the conventional places to start would be production or maybe exchange when we're thinking about economy. But I think if we start with creation, which is really all of the powers of the generative powers of the universe that always exceed us, and are really impossible to account for, then I think we're immediately displacing the human in that process. But really, if you kind of bring creation close to us, habitat, I think, is a really powerful concept for thinking about the relations of creation that kind of immediately make us and that we immediately participate in making. So I'm trying to think about different ways of understanding forms of habitat that don't ever rely on that economy, society, environment distinction. And I'm not going to go into these, but a key thing is that each of these dimensions of habitat themselves are more than human relations. And they're all things that I think are actually characteristics of life and the interactions of life itself. And Carlota, let me just say, I can't see you in this. So will you just like say something out loud when I'm running out of time?
Yes, you have
Maybe I'm
about
already
1
running.
minute left.
Okay, great. So I think it's important that this circle could easily be taken as a representation of an economy, but what I really mean it to be is actually a process diagram. It's a diagram of, in some ways, the process by which we appropriate what we inherit. We make what we inherit our own through that moment of appropriation, which is also really a moment of worlding, where we decide, are we going to engage with creation as objects for our exploitation, or are we going to engage with creation as kin, with whom we're in reciprocal relationships of responsibility? But then there's really this series of livelihood processes that move us from inheritance all the way around through some categories that are really familiar from economic anthropology. But I think in this framework, or at least I hope, actually exceed the category of economy, because there's more than human relations at every moment. But it really moves us around the circle through the process of making a living to the point where in the relations of return, which for me would include things that we talk about in terms of surplus and diverse economies theory a lot. But I think return is a much broader framework that I'm finding really helpful. But then the question is, that return is what we then return to creation, or maybe what we withhold from creation through hoarding, or the ways we despoil creation through toxic pollution. But then that really becomes the legacy through which we then contribute to creation. So I'll pause there, but just to say, kind of like a taste of one particular experimental approach to thinking, in many ways beyond the economy. I've been calling it political post-economy lately. So thanks.
Thank you, Ethan. Thank you. That was really interesting, if somewhat complex to try and grasp in 5 minutes. Fantastic. If anyone has questions, please do post them in the chat. We'll be moving on and picking questions up for the discussion later. But if you have questions now and you fear of forgetting them, please, you can write them in the chat. The next one up is Nick. If you want to introduce yourself at the beginning, that would be great. And I'll keep time. I'm not being very strict with time as well. I must say, even Ethan ran a little bit after, but that's okay because we've got plenty of time to spare at the end. So, Nikolai, I'll tell you when you've got 1 minute left.
Perfect.
Okay.
Well, thank you very much. Kia ora tātou. I'm Nick, or Nikolai. I'm at the Waipapa Toro, the University of Auckland, doing a PhD. But much like Ethan, I'm actually a farmer. I'm a winemaker. Currently just coming out of harvest, so my head has been in vats and tanks and barrels rather than the literature. So this is a bit off the cuff today. But I just want to share with you guys one sort of tool or metaphor that I've found quite helpful for thinking about and understanding the economy. And then touch on what I think is a real opportunity for sort of diverse and community economy scholarship. So yeah, I guess my PhD was interested in wine economy. I had a really difficult time with traditional understandings of economy. First of all, the fact that, everything's meant to be capitalist and this is how it should work. And then when you do field work, or when you work on farms, you realize it's really not like that at all. And in a very similar vein, this sort of problem with very linear, what Deleuze and Guattari might call arboreal thinking, in terms of the economy. So understanding the economy in terms of supply chains and value chains and very simple processes of value adding. And then in my fieldwork, that really falls apart. So I wrote a little bit about Brett, a fungal yeast, and it changes these tastes and in a very unstable way. It's culturally mediated, it's place-based. It doesn't really sit with these sorts of linear understandings of value add. So what I've found really helpful, and I haven't developed this any further than just as a tool for myself, but is thinking sort of mycelially, thinking with mycelia, as sort of a theoretical and analytical device, but also as a methodology and as a way of being in the world and ethics almost. So mycelia are, of course, these vast underground fungal networks. We often appreciate their fruiting bodies as mushrooms, but they have a huge role in sustaining all sorts of life. Made up of tiny single cell organisms, but they connect everything from the trees to the flowers. They break down rocks, they're world builders, they're together with bacteria, they create the soil. They're really this sort of hidden network that sustains. And for me, what I find really helpful is there always these interspecies encounters. It's very hard to say where the plant ends and the mycelial begins. These entanglements are sort of so intimate that this whole idea of species or individualism falls apart. And I think applying that to the economy as a metaphor works so much better for me than the sort of linear supply chain model. And so one example that I've been trying to work with is the fact that mycelia are always in the becoming. They're alive. So thinking about the economy as process rather than fixed, sort of the assemblage thinking, Deleuze and Guattari's rhizomes, all this sort of tentacular theory works much better. We often think about them as infrastructure, but they're not stable or fixed. They're lively, they're dynamic, they're moving. Their infrastructure is process, not as cement and steel. And they're always events. They're not merely gatherings, but they're happenings, to use sort of Anna Singh's language. I think there's something in the way we sort of use metaphors and images to represent things, and I think the sort of the fungal way is the way to go. And I think there's also a really opportunity for community and diverse economies scholarship. A real issue with more than human, multi-species stuff is how it translates into politics, into political economy, into decision making. It doesn't always offer a very good theory of change, or sort of the so what do you do now? And that's really where this Gibson Graham and the work of everyone in this room, I think, works really well with multi-species, more than human stuff. We can have a weak theory and we can have strong politics. We can have hopeful performativity. We can enact change. And there's quite a really hopeful, positive path by putting those two literatures in conversation with each other, which many of you have demonstrated through your work. So yeah, it's a really, really cool space to be in, and thank you very much.
Yeah. Okay, brilliant. You were well in time. I was just about to tell you had 30 seconds left. I just don't like to interrupt people while they talk, but thank you very much, Nick, for your presentation. I'm up next, and I'm also gonna share my screen. Can everyone see this? So briefly introducing myself, I'm currently a postdoc at the University of Venice in Italy. And today I'll be talking to you about some of the theoretical and sort of ethical and political insights that have come out of a project I'm working on together with other colleagues called Farms on the Move. The project looks at transhumance, which is an animal husbandry practice, which involves farm animals like goats, sheep, or cattle, that move across the landscape with farmers during different seasons in search for grass and water. Its main products are dairy and meat, and transhumance as a practice is actually spread all around the world, but we focus on the Western Alps and the Central Apennines mountain range in Italy. We've just finished our first stage of fieldwork, so today I'll mainly talk about how our project intersects and builds upon, theoretically, upon a diverse economy by conceptualizing the work of animals. And at the end, I'll just briefly discuss some of the broader implications of our less anthropocentric approach for thinking about the economy. So starting with the fact that much of Marxist-inspired work on animal agriculture has tended to focus on intensive farming systems, highlighting conditions of environmental degradation, animal suffering, and workers' exploitation. With our project, we are instead interested in reading for difference rather than dominance in animal farming, in order to make visible economic relations that are not exclusively focused on profit, but also on mutuality, care, and obligation towards animals and the wider environment. So we want to tell stories basically of marginalized farming practices that can help us imagine other ways to live and work with animals in agriculture. Now, in the diverse community economy scholarship, work is already a fundamental strategy to take back the economy. And in the foundational framework, it already recognizes the work of some non-human beings in the making of our economies, but it has so far neglected the work of animals, and especially in community food economies. In our project, we bring a less anthropocentric perspective by looking at the work of farm animals, what they do together with farmers, the effective relations that exist between them, and the kind of economic practices that this relation give rise to. To conceptualize the work of animals, we turn to French sociologist Jocelyne Porcher, whose work emphasizes how for more than 10,000 years, animals have worked with and for humans, contributing to the production of agricultural landscape, identities, knowledge, and practices. We also follow evidence in cognitive ethology that to argue that some animals are indeed intelligent beings with subjective experiences and agency, and therefore that they can engage in social relations and cooperative activities with humans. And we then use a series of structural elements that allows us to see how animals are implicated in work, to explore the possibilities of actually understanding farm animals as working subjects. So to conclude, I just wanted to raise a couple of theoretical but also ethical and political questions for community economies that follow from using a less anthropocentric perspective, and one that actually recognizes animals as working subjects. So at the theoretical level, it obviously requires reframing notions of work, something that diverse economy scholars have already done in part by moving from an exclusive attention to paid labor to unpaid or alternatively remunerated labor, and also reproductive work. But what about animals? What kind of work do animals do in our community economies, and how can we even conceptualize it? And then once we begin to explore animal contribution to our economies through the lens of work and not just as commodities, then we also ought to ask what kind of animal work is actually valuable to our community and to the animals themselves. So for instance, does a particular type of animal work preserves or endangers the commons? Or how do different social and material conditions of animal work affect our communities and environments? But also, what work do animals themselves value, and how can we appropriately recognize and value the work they do for us? And finally, if we consider that there is also more to life than work, then what would it mean for humans and animals to work and live well together? So these are just some questions that have come up from our work, and I'll finish here and we can move on to our discussion for the next 30 minutes or so. Okay. Elizabeth, shall I pass the ball to you?
Sure. Yeah, so my idea here, first of all, thank you to all the speakers. I think we had a great sort of range of initial interventions now to think about. And I would invite everyone to turn on their cameras now, since we're kind of entering a more of a group conversation period. So it's nice to see the lovely faces. Thank you so much. So the way that I was imagining doing this is very much that I will just facilitate a conversation. And if there's sort of a direction that I see emerging or something, I might sort of pull out some components of that. But it's really more just a kind of facilitation. So I would open the floor. Please raise your hand and I will make a little speakers list and call on folks as necessary. Does anyone have any questions for Ethan, Nick, or Carlotta, or sort of all of them together? Or responses, emotions that have been evoked? Yeah, Eva.
Thank you for all the intellectually and effectively and in many ways inspiring presentations. I'm actually now in a working life studies conference in Tampere, Finland, where I live in Finland. And the question I have is that while I think this is definitely what we should be focusing on when we talk about work, this is not what people are focusing on when they talk about work and when they study work. And yes, how to move forward with the massive gap that I'm and maybe others are also witnessing. Thank you.
Allison, do you want to jump in on that and then see where we're going?
I was going to ask a question more than
okay. Separate question.
Yeah, I just couldn't help but notice a pattern in all the in the presentations, which is something that with my team we're exploring as well when it comes to indigenous-led economies, is the use of space outside of a textual interface to be able to convoke and create messages. So for example, the mycelium, I'm picturing all these, regenerative little, creatures reproducing and whatnot and interacting. In the movement of animals, I'm seeing landscapes and, trans-frontier exchanges, I don't know, with different lands. And in Ethan's presentation, I also see kind of how these ideas are not boxed into specific categories, but through the spatial and reasoning, I guess, if I don't know how to best articulate it. But I'm just curious to what extent this is important when talking about moving forward in discussions in, as Ethan put it, post-economic contexts. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks for that, Allison. And I just want to mention also, if anyone needs to just post their questions in the chat, I'll kind of keep an eye on that as well. Yeah, so we have a couple questions. One about sort of this idea of opening up work and how do we communicate that to people maybe outside this space and this community. I think it was kind of where Eva was going with that. And then Allison, I think your question kind of about the use of space outside of texts, which I think is really interesting. So let's hear maybe from anybody of any of our speakers have any immediate responses. Any thoughts? Ethan, I see you're unmuting.
Yeah, I mean, I guess my response addresses kind of both of them. I think in a way, it makes so much sense that we're trying to break out of texts. I think that to speak to something that Nick was saying, I think when we talk about work with people who are really interfacing with more than human relationships on a daily basis, it's really not hard to get to that place. In some ways, it's hard when we're staying in the texts and we're staying in the concepts that we've inherited. But I think, like, for me, I'm always dancing back and forth between what could seem like a really, really abstract project. Like, I mean, that diagram I showed is like the height of abstraction. But on the other hand, like, I mean, I spend most of my life actually like with my hands in the dirt and organizing in multiracial communities, and like it's a mess. But I think that the in lots of ways the concepts are like ways of me to are ways that are helping me make sense of the mess without falling back on the old categories. And because when we're in the mess, it's really clear that like the multi-species relationships are there and present, and we just often don't have a language to talk about them. But once we start asking questions, it's like immediately apparent.
Nick, maybe we'll have a quick response from you, please.
Yeah, I mean, I really agree with Ethan. I think, Eva, if you agriculture is really one of the easiest areas to think about work in a multi-species way. A lot of my research has been on yeasts, and if you talk to a winemaker, you know, they value yeasts as workers. It's quite obvious almost in that context, like Ethan suggested. And then I just wholeheartedly agree with Alison. It's very hard to do this sort of work on text. You know, winemaking, for instance, highly sensory, trying to translate a smell or a texture or even an emotive response into words always falls short. So yeah, 100%.
Carlotta, would you like to add anything?
I agree as well with Nick and Ethan. I mean, even in our field work, I mean, I must say not necessarily all farmers actually necessarily see their animals as working, or at least farm animals. I mean, dogs, for instance, shepherd dogs or guardian dogs, they're sometimes called working dogs, and it's much easier to think of them as workers. But for instance, a goat that grazes and produces milk does not necessarily, not all farmers would call that work. But then again, with our sort of approach, we try and actually pick out particular elements that actually indicate that there is a subjective involvement of these animals in particular tasks. And they know that they've got to perform particular tasks. So even though they might not be interested in production, you know, they're not working to produce milk, they are in a relationship with the humans, and to them that's the important bit, because even in work, even for humans working, at the end of the day, production is not the ultimate goal. We also work to have social relations, to participate, to feel members of a particular group and find meaning in it. And perhaps that could be the case also for animals. As for trying to close the gap, as Eva was saying, that's an interesting question on how to go forward from that, because, you know, even in terms of humans, you know, work had an emancipatory sort of value to it, but it hasn't necessarily, you know, reached, not in all circumstances and cases. So I think there is a broader question to ask as well. If we follow also community economies thinking, that perhaps work isn't everything either. Or the type of work, perhaps we should ask ourselves the sort of conditions of work as well as important to defining what we value about work. So yeah.
Yeah, thank you for that. So we'll hear from Anna, and then there's a comment in the chat that I'll read out.
Yeah, first of all, thank you so much for the interesting presentations. I actually just finished reading your book, Ethan, so it's really nice to sort of see this presentation after that. I really enjoyed your book as well. I kind of have a question for all of you, also kind of building forth on the discussion up until now. I'm working on food forests in the Netherlands myself, and I'm currently doing a lot of field work with civil servants actually, and how they can facilitate food forestry as opposed to like monoculture industrial types of agriculture. And I wonder if any of you have any experience in talking to, civil servants or politicians or people who are not necessarily primarily engaged with, not to talk in the terms of the hegemonic trio, but like in the environment in a way, but people who are, very much sort of confined by their post as well. And especially like in the Netherlands, for example, municipalities are split up into domains, and we have like, for example, the physical domain and the social domain, and those are like separate, like they're physically separated. They are on a different floor. They don't interact. So yeah, I wonder if you have any experience in talking to people that work for various levels of government and how to sort of get them to start thinking outside of this box and not just being like sort of laughed away when you bring up the more than human, which is not their constituency in a way. Like they're very constituency oriented, and the constituency is human essentially. So yeah, I don't know if that's makes sense, but
Yeah, so I think that's a great question which goes really nicely with Irene's question, which are kind of both about how to communicate our work to different audiences. And so I'll just read. Irene is in Tasmania, so she is needing to type this because it's quite early for her. So she said she's doing a PhD in sustainable food systems, and I've been interested in exploring bringing a more than human perspective in my research, and I'm using ecological epistemology. I've been struggling with the idea of only using a written form to bring more than human perspectives in my thesis and in the way I talk about it to other people that are not familiar with it. Is there any way in which you have explored framing more than human voices? So I think it goes very nicely with Anna's question. I'll just hear from our speakers. Maybe Nick would like to go first this time. We'll kind of come around.
Sure. Yeah. No, Irene, I agree with you. I haven't quite convinced my university that I can submit a bottle of wine instead of a written thesis, but working on it. What I've found quite helpful actually is audio recordings and sounds. It's a very affective an affective mode of communication that I think works really well. So in thinking about yeasts, for example, as laborers, I've recorded the sounds of fermentation, these bubblings, and just playing that to an audience. People kind of get it rather than trying to talk about them in an abstract political economy sense. I think there's a lot in audio or in visual that can be done there. Yeah, Anna, not so much experience with civil servants. I think that's maybe more Ethan's cup of tea.
We'll go to Carlotta and then come to Ethan.
Yeah, I also don't have much experience with civil servants, but I would say that trying to translate sort of very theoretical stuff like modern human theories and perspective is not easy to any sort of sociodemographics, really. I found it hard myself, and that's why I guess it's useful then to use other mediums of expression, like Nick was saying, audio recordings or sounds. In our case, we use a lot of video materials. We're collecting a lot of data through, we're actually putting body cams on animals and we're collecting really crazy images of goats grazing and dogs running, and we're sort of still far away from sort of thinking about how best we can use these materials we're collecting, these visuals we're collecting, but I do think there is value in alternative media for expressing a sort of more than human perspective. In this case, animal perspective. In our case, would be animal perspective. Yeah.
Yeah, and Ethan.
Yeah, I think these are all really challenging things, and I think in my experience, the only way I've seen in my context these conversations really shift is in the interface between policy folks, civil servants, and indigenous communities. Because I think there's something about the depth of experience. You know, I mean, if you start from sort of a place of equity, like a sort of a very like even like a liberal discourse of equity that says we should be in conversation with indigenous communities, then to actually be in a respectful conversation immediately means, at least in my context, that more than human kin become present to the conversation really quickly. And I think that's a way for people to start taking another way of interfacing with the living world seriously. And like if I bring that, it's seen as sort of a woo-woo, like not something to be taken seriously at all. And you know, like my people like tried to systematically destroy that form of consciousness like 2,000 years ago. It's I have to dig way back to find that. But for Wabanaki communities here in Wabanaki homelands, it's like very present, and you know, people through like long resistance and persistence have maintained those relationships of kinship. And so actually being out in, say, a black ash grove that's been managed by Wabanaki communities for 2,000 years with civil servants, you know, and really having like the presence of those trees and the presence of people talking about their relationships with those trees and demonstrating like, you know, the embodied knowledge, that feels like a really transformative space. And that seems like the opening. I realize though that in the Netherlands, it's just a really different context. So I don't know how helpful that is translating to non-settler colonies.
Okay, the floor is open. Jane.
Yeah, hi. Thanks everyone. This is just so provocative, and I'm desperate to go and have my breakfast, but I'm also desperate to stay. But I suppose what I was left with was thinking after the three presentations that you know, one of the things we've talked about with community economies work is the importance of a politics of language, and all three people really talked about the limits of the language that we currently have and the importance of trying to think creatively about the ways in which we can talk past the categories that we've inherited, that Ethan in particular talked about. And I suppose, you know, that's, you know, the importance of creative thinking that we heard all three speakers talk about, you know, like Ethan with the idea of creation and so on, and Nick talking about myophilia. And then, and that's really, you know, so in community economies work, we talk about a politics of language, a politics of the subject, and a politics of collective action. And I think the language is intimately tied up with rethinking ourselves in terms of the sort of subjects we are and our interdependencies with all else. But I guess what we're sort of talking about now and what Ethan's getting at is the sort of collective action. And I just, you know, I wonder if maybe the speakers or others have got some thoughts about what does this mean for thinking about what a politics of collective action might be, in particular a collective action that in some way, you know, explicitly involves the more than human. So I just, you know, throw that out there for people.
Yeah, and thanks Jenny for kind of mentioning that like this doesn't have to just be a moderated conversation between like questions from the audience and speakers and response from the speakers. So if anybody has comments that are, you know, relative, they want to answer the questions as well, please jump in. Yeah, so thinking about politics of collective action, maybe we'll hear from Jane and then kind of think through this next pair of questions.
Yeah, thank you. I'll be presenting soon, but I actually had a sort of, I guess, taking us back to Anna's question. So I might just respond to that and then maybe we can move on with Jenny's question. But I was just going to say, Anna, you know, the work that I do, which I'll talk about soon is around urban community gardening. And so I've worked with, in a lot of cases, with politicians and with folks who, trying to bridge the gap between the needs of urban community gardeners. Hi, the needs of urban community gardeners, and kind of what's happening with the city of Toronto, where I work, with the political aspect. And it can be really hard to try to kind of speak to the more than human with folks who are civil servants, as you said, who are politicians, et cetera. And I've found that something that seems to really speak to folks is the aesthetic. And we've already, others speakers have spoken to this idea of including other types of media. But that's something that I've found to be really powerful, is that we'll ask gardeners to take pictures of their gardens. We'll ask them to take videos of their gardens. And then, at like policy meetings, we'll show those. And we find that, I guess in that sense, you're kind of policy workers are seeing the garden through the eyes of a human, because it is coming from, a visual medium that's taken by a human. But we find that aesthetic of seeing a flower, seeing a tree, it really can speak to folks who aren't kind of working in these spaces and aren't thinking about the more than human as an actor. So I think that would be, again, I'm coming at it from a very kind of practical perspective, but that's something that I've found, just to add, can help to sort of bridge that gap in a more, I think, less, as Ethan said, it can come across as a bit woo-woo at times, but sometimes grounding it in like, here's a slideshow with an image can be really valuable. So, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I guess I would just jump on your comments, Jane, to say that, like, I've worked quite a lot in international environmental policy spaces, and I think in those areas as well, there's not a lot of space for like kind of academic speak in the style in which we are practicing right now, for example. So it is important to kind of pick exactly like when and how to make your little interventions. And, for those communities, it has worked in quite a subtle way, but I think there is an international recognition of Indigenous and local peoples' knowledges, and that has kind of worked its way into the policy space in an important way. And so that's kind of one thing that you can trigger. And I think using images has worked really effectively, and also having people from many different countries in those spaces and making sure that you are helping to highlight whatever they're saying in different kind of ways. And I think that kind of goes a little bit with Bhavya's comment in the chat about this idea that different languages actually have different types of meaning making and framing. And Bhavya writes, I find more than human agency often features in some of these languages quite easily. In their work in India across 4 languages. English is specifically anthropocentric, while acknowledging most languages we speak and understand are human-centered. So there's, and just a little bit of conversation in the chat about also the role of artists and organizing and having kind of spending time in meetings outside, and just for the sheer impact of that experience. Okay, I see Molly and Bethany.
I'm actually just gonna, haven't entirely followed the conversation very coherently, because I've also been sending Nye off to school, but it links into Katrienne's point, because I also like the use of art practices, and particularly embodied art practices. So I've had a series of projects over the last 4 years, which have been initially around human relationships with stone and a former quarry that's now a housing development, and then more recently an urban section of the longest river in the North Island of New Zealand, the Waikato, and thinking about how do we think about the way we live with these more than human kin now in a way that kind of is acknowledging the Indigenous knowledge and experience, as well as the settler experience here in Aotearoa. And the way in which we've engaged with that is through sound and kind of somatics. So people thinking about and really drawing attention to their bodily experience of these things, and So for example, really thinking about the way in which stone is in our bodies, or water is in like already part of who we are, and how we are as a body quite porous to these other that we as a human, we are not separate. We already have these things in us. We are made up of them. And so, and somehow that kind of more poetic invitation to think about that in a really embodied, creative way as you move through a place and have kind of physical, tactile contact with those elements is quite powerful for a very general. So these were like just public, anybody walk up off the street, do these sort of kind of immersive sound performance works through the place. That's kind of layered with a more like those more kind of known frameworks of how we engage in terms of narrative and history and what we can see and those, you know, the everyday. So yeah, but to bring it in as part of that, and people then sort of tune in a way that we're not really called to tune in every day. Anyway, so that was a comment, not a question, but just responding to the conversation about arts. So thank you, but I love the presentations. Thank you everybody so far.
Super, thanks, Molly. Yeah, Bethany.
Thanks. Yeah, I will just follow up on the artistic discussion that we've just had a little bit, but I just want to think, yeah, the presentations were really fantastic, and I think it's so important that we're thinking about the language and the translation into collective action, as Jenny asked about. But just quickly on the artistic practice, I think all of us, yes, the effective and embodied aspects that we've been talking about are really critical. I'm surprised, Nick, that you can't submit a bottle of wine. I would have thought that could have been an actual immersive exhibition. We would do that in creative practice all the time at our university. Not a bottle of wine. Never said a bottle of wine, but I think there's definitely scope for that, you know, to push that a little bit, to think about what that actually, because it is a form of creative practice research. We could frame it in that way. But I think that I do work quite a bit, and I'll be talking in the next session as well, with public servants. And I think that immersive experience is important, but I just wanted to problematize it a little bit, because I do tend to see quite a lot of expectation that things will be homogenous in all the gardens that we, like, for example, if I'm working in community gardens or community composting, there's a sense that, like, we've had an experience in this one place, these gardens look good, they look this way, they should be done in this way. And then in the policy, there's little room for difference and diversity to necessarily express itself in different ways. So I think that remains a challenge. You might get some people on board, but I don't necessarily think that capacity to understand the diversity and difference and making space for the multiple ways in which we, you know, different forms of growing and different forms of composting might need to enact in different unique conditions is not necessarily reflected. So I think we've still got to sort of really remain vigilant around that sort of thing, rather than getting, you know, one homogenous perspective through. Thanks. Again, a comment.
Yeah, no, but I think there's definitely like a lot of kind of key themes that keep bubbling up in the comments and the discussion. And I think it is kind of helping us to expand a little bit on the different elements that we want to have at play in our conversations about engaging with Earthkin and bringing in different communities, bringing in different voices. Yeah, oh, look at that. Matthew?
Thank you so much. This is a really interesting conversation, and I'm glad to join you all. So I think a lot about children and education and the role in sort of reconstituting these anthropocentric understandings of being in the world. And I'm reminded that, you know, that way of seeing the world has to be re-educated with each generation. It's not necessarily something inherent to anyone, at least as I understand it. Correct me if I'm wrong. But I'm wondering if anyone then has worked with children, younger children especially, but not exclusively, as another really important members of communities in thinking about changing some of these relationships. And related to that, maybe to Jenny's point, I mean, the idea of an economy already is not something that's immediately obvious, but it's become so because the way it's spoken about. So now it's sort of this naturalized term. Everybody knows what the economy is. So it doesn't seem so out of reach when we think about the work that's constantly done socially, culturally to reinforce these terms, that if we think of a sort of a child growing up in the world, maybe it's not so far out of reach to, you know, help to support very different ways of relating to other beings.
Yeah, thank you for that, Matthew. I'm just reminded of like some conversations I've been in lately where we talk about how much we teach children kind of conflicting messages, where we try to encourage them to be really creative in one space and then absolutely understand what's real and not real in another space according to a certain kind of ontology. So maybe that's a really interesting sort of entry point into the earlier comment about how do we talk about the more than human and engage and start to shift maybe English within the English language away from a sort of anthropocentric perspective. Eva, do you want to jump in, or I saw that you're busy typing away maybe, but.
Yes, it's been a very long day, so maybe I will try to type it better. I'm still thinking of the gap, and I think it's still like I'm very happy of everything that has been said, and I'm thinking a lot of the sort of bridging the gap, but yet I'm still quite concerned, and this is maybe the long day
Yeah.
of like thinking funding applications. I'm thinking of just this community of people that I've been talking today who do a lot of developmental work with companies and exactly the public administrations and so forth. And, you know, this is just a typical, perhaps the cynical thoughts that we are very good at producing, or at least I am as an academic, because I think it's very important to consider other ways of knowing and not just put the cap on to say that it's not realistic, or there's not funding, or there's not that, or there's not. So yeah, yes, but I will, if I can type something more concrete, I will do it.
Sounds good. Well,
can I jump in for a second, Zah?
Yes, please. Perfect. Thanks, Ethan.
Yeah, I guess just like building on some various things that people have been saying. I think Jenny talking about language politics, you know, Matt bringing back the economy. I'm 100% on board with all of these non-language approaches. I think they're really, really important. But I also think that the language politics really plays a role here. I mean, I've had so many experiences now where if you start the conversation with the economy, you're already like, you've sort of like lost the terrain when it comes to having these kinds of conversations. But like, I mean, I've had so many experiences of starting a conversation from a place of livelihoods and like from that language specifically. And then, you know, like if we start by saying like, let's not talk about the economy. Let's talk about what sustains us. You know, what relationships are we in as we make our livings with what beings, and, you know, what are the relationships of sustenance that we participate in? Like, who do we sustain? Like, if we can have the conversation at that level, I think the conversation just really changes from the outset. There's a lot more space to be talking about other kinds of relationships. And so it feels like an uphill battle because the economy is so ingrained, you know, and I don't know where we teach our children, you know, other frameworks for thinking about these things. And I think that's why I'm so enthusiastic about, like, I don't really care if it's livelihoods or not, but like we need, you know, 100 different variations of entry points that break the economy and that open up a totally different kind of conversation right from the outset. That is also a really recognizable conversation. Like, it's not weird to talk about what sustains us, you know, who do we sustain? So I just feel so curious about other languages, and then what are the spaces to do the pedagogy to actually get those things circulating in ways that are actually used in real conversation in our institutions.
Yeah, I mean, I do want to say something, building on your comments, Ethan, because I've been thinking for the last while here that a lot of the conversation that we're having around more than humans, earthkin, you know, the sort of different vocabularies that we're choosing to engage with and use to construct these languages within our academic discourses are in some ways like an attempt for it's it's an attempt for those of us working in these universities and in this type of like knowledge production communities to think through and think back towards other ontologies that have different sort of relationalities with earthkin and with the world around us, but that we needed to do it in a way that made sense based on our own training and our own ontology. And so in some ways it's you know, we're creating a language and we're working through with the tools that we have as academically trained people to get us to a place that aligns, you know, with other languages, with other ontologies, and maybe that's okay. You know, like that's the work that we needed to do to bring ourselves into that space. So Ava has kind of expanded on her comment a little bit in the chat to think about again, this kind of tension between how this works as a sort of knowledge production process within the university and how it is completely different, like kind of phenomenological, experiential life and death situation for people kind of out in the world. And I think part of the diverse economies sort of collective action practice within diverse economies is about connecting kind of the university and the rest of the world, right? And no longer kind of having like we're in this university setting and then here's all the activists and all of the people who are having to like fight the good fight. So I think it's a really great sort of way to engage, like, okay, so where are we gonna do this sort of different forms of collective action that engage and use our academic strengths and our academic work and bring us into closer conversations in different ways, and not to kind of decide that we need to abandon one or the other in order to make the conversation move further. So I was going to sort of give the last word of this hour to Carlotta and Nick, if you have any kind of last words, and then I think we would take our break. But anything from the two speakers now that you want to just kind of like wrap up this part of the session?
Nick, do you have any comments or?
Oh, not really. I think for thinking about livelihoods and Ethan, for me, it's been health. I think that's a concept that everyone can get, and that can lead really well into environmental governance and microbes. And I think COVID has actually helped in some way of how we think about that. But yeah, this has been fantastic. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Nick. Thanks, everyone. I'm just a little bit conscious of time. We're running 5 minutes behind, but that's all right. I planned a 5-minute break. So it's 6 past now. Perhaps we meet again at 11 past the hour. Okay. See you in a bit.
Okay.
Okay. Everyone is coming back in. Is Jane back? Because she's the next speaker. Ah, Jane is here. There you are. I couldn't see you. All right. So next three presentation, we start with Jane. Whenever you're ready, Jane.
Let me share my screen here. Slideshow. Okay, is everyone seeing my screen? Gorgeous. Yep. Okay, so hi everyone, my name is Jane. I am in Toronto, colonially known as Toronto. I'm a recent graduate of the University of Toronto, and I do work on other than capitalist subjectivity and more than human commons. So I'm going to be speaking about or presenting a portion of a larger project which I did for my thesis. And I'm going to be, of course, kicking us off with these more practical provocations. So I'm going to speak to some of the themes which we've already touched on, but in a very grounded way. And I'll also be moving us from farmland to the urban space. So I've worked in urban community gardening for a while, and I noticed kind of the impact that gardening seemed to have on gardeners' ways of being. And so I became really interested in subjectivity formation in urban gardens. And I wondered what kind of subjectivities were cultivated in these spaces and why. So I did a research project which concluded a couple months ago, where I visited 10 gardens, community gardens in Toronto, and I conducted 30 interviews with this question in mind around what subjectivities are formed in these spaces. And I found, somewhat unsurprisingly, probably, that gardeners tended to form relational subjectivities. So they came to see themselves as intimately connected with all other beings. And this subjectivity, a relational subjectivity, of course, it inherently challenges a more anthropocentric, individualistic way of being. So gardeners forged this relational subjectivity due to a few factors, but the main one was their interaction with the more than human. Gardeners seem to forge these kind of deep communal symbiotic relationships with the more than human. So what I found most interesting about this research was the why. Why and in what ways did their interaction with more than humans and in urban community gardens in specific, why did these spaces foster this relational subjectivity? So gardeners, to answer this question, gardeners first, they spoke a lot to the cyclical nature of working in a community garden, this cyclical nature of this yearly return to the garden and the kind of engagement with a plant's whole life cycle. It seemed to really enhance the connection between plant and human and to ultimately result in this kind of more relational subjectivity. And I have a quote here from a gardener speaking to this idea that, seeing a seed, planting a seed, seeing that seed go through harvest and then replanting that seed, that built this really deep relationship for them. Next, there was this kind of interspecies communication that I saw take place. So gardeners spoke to the fact that being in the same garden, the same urban community garden for a prolonged period of time, being with these same plants, it allowed them to develop an understanding of their plants and even in some cases, an ability, they would say, to communicate with those plants. So gardeners came to see plants as animate and they saw themselves as, again, being in relationship with them. So this is a quote from a gardener. So he says, I can talk with these plants, I can ask what they want, and I can understand them. Then there was very much an ethics of care present in the gardens that I worked with. So gardeners, interestingly, to our conversation about language, they talked about the plants as if they were family members, and they often referred to them as their children, using pronouns for individual plants. So this indicated a recognition of animacy, and also that it really showed the care that gardeners had for their plants, as of course, care in most traditions, is closely tied to the family. And of course, care is also highly relational. So gardeners extended their familial affinities through their care for the plants, and they seem to almost fold the plants into their family unit, again, creating this more relational subjectivity. And I have some quotes here about gardeners speaking about how they felt as if they were in an almost parental relationship with the plants, though this relationship changed through the growing process. I also noticed, this is quite a powerful and moving one, the co-flourishing and co-becoming that took place in urban community gardeners. Gardeners were able to really develop these relationships of reciprocity, one in which, Carlota, I see you, am I
1 minute?
One in which both the plant and the gardener flourished and changed. And this was, present in a really moving conversation that I had with the gardener, where he was in a process of recovery from addiction. And he spoke about how being in community with the plants helped him to see his own growth. And he found that very healing, while also the plants were flourishing because he was caring for them. I'm almost done. But so also many gardeners expressed that they had come to see the process of food production as a collaborative one with the more than human. So to use the word, in the words of Puigla Belacasa, whose work I engage with a lot, they came to see planting as a process of power with more than humans rather than a process of power over more than humans. And last, a lot of gardeners use this language of coexistence. So they seem to question the kind of Eurocentric, anthropocentric hierarchy, and they aim to be in a state of coexistence with more than human actors. So, this gardener, she asked this rhetorical question of why can't we exist? Why can't we work together with plants and animals to have enough food for all? So ultimately, these aspects of the more than human relationships, which can be developed in community gardens, they seem to indicate that gardeners had cultivated these more relational ways of being and therefore less anthropocentric view of the world. So kind of my conclusion I put forward is, because I do a lot of work in these urban community garden spaces, I do feel very strongly that, a lot of more than human research has happened in more rural areas. But these urban spaces are really generative at trying to build these more relational, life-giving worlds. So, thank you.
Thank you, Jane. That was great. Very interesting. We'll just quickly move on so that we can have discussion later. The next one up is Bethany. Whenever you're ready.
Great. That's all good, is it?
Yep, we can see it. I can see it. Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you. Lots of similar themes to Jane, so that will be exciting for discussion. So yes, hi everyone. I'm zooming from Ngunnawal Ngambri country in Canberra, the capital of Australia. And I'm going to focus on some projects that we've been working on here with colleagues. I've been working with colleagues as well in looking at how we experiment with how to navigate ethical relations through more than human research collaborations. I'm going to talk in particular about 3 studies that have lots of overlapping themes. So one is looking at a school garden and intergenerational learning in a socioeconomically and sociolinguistically diverse school. And the second is looking at urban community gardens, particularly with a focus on refugee resettlement and migrant experiences. And the third is looking at urban community composting initiatives. So I'll start by saying that the core part, also, I guess we start all of these projects is from looking at more than human ethical negotiations through an anti-colonial approach. And we take our cue in particular from the work of Max Liboron, the founder of the CLEAR Centre, who advances an anti-colonial research agenda that aims to resist, quote, the settler and colonial entitlement to land and Indigenous cultures, concepts, knowledges and life. So given that the growing of food and the soil building activities that we look at occur on and with stolen lands that are designated by their very ownership, owned by schools, owned by the government, owned by churches or owned by private individuals, and generally accepted to be positive activities often funded through competitive grants, resisting the notions of entitlement to land requires considerable and ongoing effort. And our efforts to resist are mainly focused on attending to and highlighting the way these places emerge through entangled more than human relationality that disrupts human control and notions of ownership. So relationality among all entities is foundational to First Nations Australian ways of knowing, being and doing, and this informs our approach to thinking about country. And country is a First Nations Australian concept that expresses the interconnection and relationality of the skies, the land, the rocks, the vegetation, the animals, and the role they all play in creating our world and worlds. And these relations are, of course, active, and they carry responsibilities and obligations to learn and act with human and non-human entities. So across these three studies, where non-humans are integral active components of more than human communities, we work to show how relations and relationality are values that really matter in these sites and in the actions that activate them. So we also emphasise how the value of understanding relationality is core to the alternative or diverse economy propositions of these activities in these places. Can move through. Yep. That's actually the three things. I should have moved through that slide before. Okay, so we do this through the use of multi-species and multisensorial methods that are focused on place and activity-specific attentiveness and practices. And this involves surfacing and tracing interactions that occur through gardening or deep in the compost heap. So sometimes this involves a little bit like Carlotta using GoPros, but we're using them on humans. We can't put them on worms yet, haven't worked that out. But we do stick cams down into compost heaps to see what's going on inside there. And we do put trail cams and audio recorders up in places where we aren't to see what's happening when we are not there. Things that we might not normally see. So we aim to follow both non-humans and humans through these sites to try and story their connections through talk, video, audio, and photos, all those things we talked about before. One thing that we notice emerging across these diverse sites is what I see as the value multiplier of a sense the more than human connection that we refer to as ecological belonging. So ecological belonging differs from the common notion of place attachment in two key ways. And place attachment seems to imply a sense of connection to a site rather than to the very relations that animate it. And the focus on attachment also displaces concepts of detachment, implying that connection forged through positive, loving interactions is the most valuable kind and the one that we should all be aspiring to. So ecological belonging instead attempts to make space for diverse relationality where there might be some feelings of attachment and connection, but also detachment from other things due to intense experiences of alterity. So ecological belonging is not forged nor maintained through harmonious, easy relations alone. While ecological belonging, as we understand it, often emerges in response to very local experiences, we also find that it stretches beyond the temporalities and spatialities of specific places because it provides opportunities to learn the skills and nurture the capacities to recognise, attune and respond to and with diverse environmental contexts, such as climate, weather and soil and its multi-species components. So we think this makes a critical contribution to revaluing more than human relations as foundational to collective futures. So ecological belonging, in summary, is relational. It involves peer-to-peer learning where both humans and non-humans are considered to be peers in a process of co-learning to live well together. It is anti-colonial. It understands we're not entitled to use lands and its multi-species resources and Indigenous knowledges in an extractive way. It's forged through development of skills and capacities to be attentive and responsive, that skills we hone through noticing, observing and attending. And it aims to unsettle borders and boundaries by inviting in difference and diversity rather than excluding. So it eschews the privileging of particular forms of belonging. And it's a practice, not a goal. It's never fully realised or settled, but requires constant work. And while it's practiced locally, it holds the whole world in these actions. It nurtures, finally, attentive relations in the present that aim to incorporate the futures we need to strive for as humans and non-humans learn the arts of living well together in times of flux. And I think that's my time.
It is.
Thanks.
Thank you, Bethany. The next one's up are Alison and Ignacio.
Yes, I just wanted to... Hi, everyone. My name is Alison Guzman, and I'm based here in Mapuche Ancestral Territory in southern Chile, where I've been working and collaborating with Mapuche communities upon invitation since 2013 with my colleague and partner Ignacio. I just wanted to kind of give you guys a little context of where we're at, because as we also view territory as agent in the Earth Other, or well, that doesn't make sense, more than human, because Earth Other would be like another planet. But when, and we're just lucky that there are 42 million indigenous people still living in this region, and about 560 indigenous languages are still spoken, which each language in itself entails a certain knowledge as well. So historically, this is the territory, kind of the Walmapu, and the Mapuche resisted Spanish conquest for 3 centuries. It was only when it became part of Chile that it finally became occupied through military occupation about 142 years ago. So it's pretty recent. The Mapuche economy is based on agriculture, and most people know about the Mapuche economy through material elements such as textiles and silverwork. So we are working, let's see, so I'm just gonna keep going. So where we are working, I don't know if you can see the arrow, but it's this lake that was created by a tsunami in the 60s, and now it holds, it's a water flow, and this is where we're at today, coastal community lake of the Lefkenche peoples. Let me go ahead and pass it over to my colleague, Ignacio.
Yeah, you can just leave that there. So,
okay.
So we wanted to enter this discussion through a concept, a Mapuche concept that encapsulates, in a way, their vision of less anthropocentric approaches to economy. It is pronounced in Mapuche ethico-political, and in the website of the organization, Mapuche organization we work with, is translated as the set of tangible and intangible elements of the biocultural heritage central to Mapuche life, including spiritual energies or Newen, and the Che, or human person, as indissoluble parts of the diversity of life that makes up each space or loft that we as Mapuche inhabit. So this kind of definition in English or Spanish in the hegemonic languages is in itself problematic. We've been actually problematizing this with the communities and see how can this actually be communicated more truthfully to their conception of this less anthropocentric approach to life and therefore economies. But it's very difficult to define it because it's basically linked to an entire conceptual and linguistic framework that includes the idea of Kumemongen, of a good life. It includes the idea of Mapuche, people of the land, and includes the idea of, it was mentioned, the idea of love, which is is translated as community, but it's actually a human and other than human community within a specific space, the concept of love. But more than trying to define this, I would like to just say that this is a concept, ethico-political, that has gained importance for the Mapuche people as a tool or as a weapon, let's say, to mobilize in defense of their territory, their lands, their culture, their waters, and biodiversity as components of an integral life form. But for the dominant society, this has been very difficult to take on, which brings me to a second. Yeah. So what brings me to mention that is a concept that is also central to the possibility of a dialogue of knowledge around environmental issues and particularly the planetary crisis. So, Alison, maybe you can wrap it up, I guess. You are mute.
we won't have time to view the video, but I did want to share this collaboration we did a couple of years ago called It's About Language, and our colleague Fernando Quilaqueo is basically this explains what itrofirmongen is. So I will put the link in the chat, and I encourage you to take a look, because in the end, the relationship that we have with more than human is also about bridging, and how do we bridge, and language is one big part of that, and maybe learning the language of that territory enables new ways of thinking. So that's kind of what we're exploring right now. Let me share it with them.
Well, just
Yeah.
well, our idea was also to say that we encountered this less anthropocentric view through practice. It was originally not a theoretical exercise, but a long process of collaboration where basically we've been approaching this from collaborative practice and this sort of mediation of translation that Alison is mentioning.
And I'll go ahead and share the website too of where we're at today. I guess I felt that the timing was not best, but here is the website of, we're working on indicators through non-textual elements. So that was also one of the reasons why I asked that question. Space and categories, how is that built? Because we do use audio, video, and a lot of younger generations are participating in these conversations.
Thank you very much, Alison and Ignacio. That was very interesting. Thanks for sharing the link for everyone there in the chat. Elizabeth, you want to take over?
Sure. Yeah, I think I'll do my best. Where I'll I'm sorry, it's getting close to my bedtime, but I think this was a great sort of next set of papers, and I have some comments, but I think I'm going to be able to just open up the floor and see what others are thinking also. Others' responses, questions, comments. Maybe as people are kind of pulling their thoughts together, I could just start by asking Alison if you guys might talk a little bit more about these indicators through non-textual elements, because I've been spending a lot of time in the last few years trying to wrap my head around indicators and like what they are, how to use them, what they mean, why are they good, why are they bad, you know? So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Sure, yeah. So this has been a long-term process in a way, and this was actually a question that Stephen Healy mentioned in our presentation yesterday, or he asked us about the use of evaluation as part of our work, and indeed we have been using a kind of internal monitoring evaluation scheme, but in a very in an adjusted way, using illustration to work with our team on whether the steps that we are going through are satisfactory in terms of impact in the community. And this involves both the mutual savings group that we co-designed with the communities, but also now Indigenous-led conservation. But it was through that process that we quickly realized that economy, and actually I appreciate Ethan's comment earlier, is really just kind of like the background motor that keeps the main vision, which is restoration. What is Mapuche restoration? Because of various reasonings, there is an urgent need to restore their land and territory, and suddenly we're talking about life, but we're also talking about death. I mean, there is a loss of diversity, there's a loss of certain species that have kept traditional livelihoods ongoing. So this is where we're at right now. And from a very Western origin, indicators has always been the observed, like in that that, you know, it's something that we as an outsider are counting in a way. So the indicator is kind of like a placeholder, right? So we're still trying to figure out if there's another word for it, but, and I'll pass it on to my Ignacio. But we're exploring then the action around it, because that has been a clear difference in terms of seeing theory of change and impact, is how the person is actually involved in this restoration process. And this has been part of an ongoing dialogues and series of community consensus building around concepts such as this. Yes, Ignacio.
No, just very briefly, just that we are developing these indicators around practice, around relational practice. A little bit what Ethan, I think also mentioned that if I'm not wrong, that these less anthropocentric possibilities are found in sort of a concrete practice. I don't know if it was Ethan who said that, but so this what I'm showing here is a diagram, that expresses a four-dimensional integral vision of biocultural restoration, or the restoration of eutrophial monyen through and we are building currently these indicators around practice, around how this eutrophial monyen is sustained and restored through relational practice in these four different areas that I don't think I have the time to explore in a deeper way, but that represents sort of the more intimate relation with land in the household, the defense of the territory that includes collaboration with Western science, the economic part, the idea of regenerative economies,
or
and
livelihoods.
or livelihoods, and education and communications towards the territory and beyond. So yeah, I'm going to. But it's been a challenge to actually put numbers and to objectify these practices that are common in the Mapuche tradition. This is all the evaluation of the processes is done through permanent oral feedback. So, so how to combine both has been challenging. We were talking about it with Steven yesterday. But in a way it's a need, because the people in the territory feel it as a need, because they do need to, again, establish bridges and some sort of dialogue with science and policy in the face of this sort of dire situation of, planetary crisis.
And we are, and the communities are collaborating with universities that clearly have their methodologies on scientific indicators, to which the community youth and monitors are developing capacities to become monitors themselves using these scientific tools. But how is that harnessed with, or harnessed within a broader Mapuche way of knowledge and way of being?
Yeah, I mean, just a quick follow-up on that is that I mentioned earlier that I was doing this international environmental work, and so it was with the IPBES, Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, and I was part of the Sustainable Use Assessment that happened a few years ago. And this exact topic of indigenous indicators came up at that meeting and became something that people were very interested in. And I think that combining the sort of political power that has been mobilized around bringing in indigenous voices into those spaces with the sort of language of indicators, which that community is very comfortable with and sort of understands how to approach somehow, was something that was one of those kind of potential inroads and like moments where you can affect change in a space where was really meaningful and have kind of a different impact. So and it was very much through like the kinds of figures that you just showed, Ignacio, of like bringing in these kind of images that had been worked on with communities and are showing, like also we had a lot of these kind of annual wheels that represented sort of different seasonal change in relationships with the nature and environment were based. So yeah, I think that's like definitely something that addresses some of the questions and discussion that came up earlier as well. Other comments, questions, thoughts?
I have a question. Oh, sorry.
No, I was gonna say something to fill the space.
Yeah, I think for all of you, but maybe particularly Jane and Bethany, I'm really interested in kind of what you're doing with the material that you've been generating and gathering, so your data, for want of a better word, but in terms of engaging then with the community again around that. So Bethany, like I'm just imagining like the children in the school garden seeing the footage of what's happening in their compost overnight, or, you know, and imagining how amazing that would be as a sort of for the children. And then, but Jane, I'm also interested, now you've got all of that amazing the narratives and stories and quotes from the people. Have you taken that back to the people involved with the gardens in any way?
Sure, I can go first. And, you know, it's interesting because this is something I've been thinking about a lot myself, you know, bringing these conversations back to folks, because, you know, I have been in conversation with some folks who I had these conversations with. And I think because I use a feminist methodology in my work, I do like to really ground it in the conversations and to put, you know, to really try to decenter my own voice. And so I'm kind of trying to figure out the practical logistical ways, because I've now done and have no more funding. So I'm trying to figure out, you know, how to do that work of going back into communities, and also figuring out practically, you know, beyond this just, you know, getting published, what will it actually do in the gardens? You know, what work are we actually doing here? So that's something I've been considering a lot myself, is how to go back. Yeah.
Great. And yeah, I'll talk specifically about the school project, which is an ongoing project with funding, luckily. And that process of going back to we are lucky that we have some key events built into that project, whereby we do bring that footage, we do bring back the materials that we have collated and share it as a kind of analytical process with the children as well. We're trying to you know, make sure that they are co-researchers in the process, but part of that involves, one of the key things I think we've done there is actually getting them to produce some artworks in response to some of that material as an ongoing. So it actually generates another set of materials that we then need to work out a way to bring back to them, which we haven't worked that stage out yet. But yes, it's an ongoing iterative process. But I think that it enables, it's really critical to actually, I think, you know, not be, of course, we are not the external researchers in this more than human space. We're working with the children, but also taking it back to the garden, so that those responses are occurring in the garden as well. That artwork and is occurring in the garden, and quite often it's using materials from the garden, you know, plants and things like that as part of that process. I'm not sure if that's, you know, sufficiently decentering things, but it's something that we're working with. Thanks, Molly, for the question.
Allison, yeah.
Yeah, I was just kind of thinking when hearing you speak, Bethany, also about how something that we're kind of experimenting, because we have we have these spaces of workshops, but sometimes the workshops just disinflates and nobody remembers anything. I mean, it's very typical workshop situation. So one thing that we're experimenting with is like mentorship programs where women are designated to become a specific experts in a certain knowledge holder, whether it's basket making or agroecological seed knowledge or native seed knowledge, or even ceramics. So and the idea is that they mentor a group of people over a long period of time. Like they're always they're like a human archive kind of thing. They're accessed. And it's something that we're experimenting, that we just started. Because we're working with schools too, and we're just trying to see if this is something that might be relevant as well. But anyways, I just was thinking about that listening to you speak, Bethany. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that, Ethan.
Yeah, this is this is maybe a bit of an unformed thought, but I'm just thinking, like, experiencing the beautiful, compelling work that you all are doing with Mapuche communities, and thinking about my own experiences working with Wabanaki communities here. There's like the work of restoration that you talked about feels like a very different kind of work than what lots of the other work that we've expressed here is, which is sort of like when, you know, it feels like one of the inheritances of colonialism for the colonizer, for my people, is the broken relationship, which includes a broken ontology that doesn't offer, you know, me and my people the resources we need to actually be rebuilding these reciprocal, responsible interrelationships. And I think, Zah, some of what you were talking about was getting at this to me, like how kind of like awkward and difficult the languages are, and we're like, you know, moving, like building bridges between academic language and like so-called practice, which for indigenous communities, like it's not a separable thing. Like there's not like theory and practice. Like that itself is part of the brokenness, I think, that we inherit. And so I guess I'm just struck by that, and like how so much of this, for those of us that are inheriting colonial culture, is like really a matter of invention rather than restoration. And that's a huge haul. Like there's so many different dimensions to that, and that's such a long generational process. And you know, I think I'm just sitting in a lot of curiosity about like what does that work of cultural invention actually look like? And I mean, I think many people in this space are participating in that in lots of different ways, and it just strikes me to think about the work in that way.
Yeah, that's super interesting. Ethan, Ignacio, do you want to just respond to that?
Yeah,
and then...
respond to that. Yeah,
Yeah.
just very briefly, Ethan. This whole thing of restoration is really problematic because what you just said, and because, you know, there's now restoration is like in the top of the so-called nature-based solutions to climate change. There's going to be a lot of money pouring in, and frankly, it's not well understood whether we are talking about the same thing or how do you do this in a way that is actually in accordance to human rights and so on. I mean, basically, so you're right. I mean, in a way, the indigenous peoples have these long traditions of knowledge that they can hold on to and restore, you know, these social economic systems that are still there, even if damaged. But the Western, in a Western rationalistic anthropocentric framework, is really hard to determine the indicators of restoration. What are we talking when we talk about restoration? And therefore, you know, tree plantations pass as restoration. And, you know, whatever restoration and money pouring in. So it's really a key issue, I think.
Yeah. I think I want to pick up on that, but I don't want to lose Bhavya's comment, so I'll just mention, read this. If anyone would like to share any reflections on self-transformation and unlearning/relearning experience as part of knowing, doing, being in relational contexts with more than human kin. So I think it goes very well with what we're talking about right now as well.
I'm happy
Bethany,
to, yes, I'll share some thoughts. Yeah, thanks. I think both really interesting questions and points. And I'll just say, Ethan, I think that concept of invention is really productive, or creation or creativity, and various ways of expressing that, I think, is really important to look at. I haven't talked about the work here, but I do a lot of work with First Nations Australians communities. They're not here today, so I won't speak to that work. But whilst we're talking about the brokenness of some of those connections, one of the things that we do in that work is we re-story those connections. So re-story stories that have been lost about place because of, in Australia, the stolen generation, Aboriginal people taken from their families, and those connections were severed. And so there's a restoring process that can occur, which is quite productive and quite exciting. But around this, the self-transformation, I think I'll talk about the unlearning and relearning. I think the whole process is absolutely, as a colonizer, as a non-Indigenous person, or of colonial heritage, is to unlearn. There's an awful lot of unlearning that has to occur constantly in these gardens. I'm talking about in these particular sites that I work in, and I see a lot of shared learning that can occur with people from diverse backgrounds coming together to share that kind of knowledge and rethink those relationships. But I think it's hard. I think it's hard work. And I'm really interested to hear what Jane says, because she's identified obviously some really generative relationalities that are occurring in these spaces, which I think occur too. And I've seen that occur too. But I think there is so much unlearning as part of that process to reimagine that relationship, as opposed to, and I'll just talk quickly about one of the gardens that we work in with refugees that have come from other places where they've had a really strong agricultural background, and they come to Australia, and there's an assumption they'll do a community garden will really help them connect to place, and it's really actually does exactly the opposite. The first experience there is actually really challenging, because none of the practices that they have brought with them work. The things that they want to grow, the things that the climate in Canberra is a bit crappy. It's very frosty. It's very difficult. It's very different. And so the learning that has to occur for these people in that environment is huge. And I think it requires ongoing work and support to be able to work through that. And I think then there's a really productive change that occurs, but we can't, it is bloody hard. It's bloody hard for everyone, no matter what their background is. Yeah. Over to you, Jane, for thoughts.
No, thank you, Bethany. I have so many things in my brain percolating from this discussion. Yeah, I think, well, I just wanted to say first off to that point about, I think especially in the literature, but in general, there can be this kind of view of community gardens, especially in urban spaces, as being somehow like, the savior that will have this fantastic impact, and everyone's going to have a great time. And the reality is that that's often not the case. Often these spaces they can be quite colonial in nature, depending on who is doing the work within them. They can, they often, if you have folks, as you said, like I experienced very similar things where there are folks coming from elsewhere, immigrant gardens, refugee gardens, and it wasn't, the experience that I think folks' experience was different than I think what we had expected it would be. So there is so much learning and unlearning that takes place in these spaces. And I think especially in the context that, I'm in here recently to speak about the colonial aspect of the gardens. Recently the Toronto municipality put in this program to have gardens that would be tended by Indigenous youth, like all across the city. And these gardens were placed within existing community gardens. And this program it did not work. There was, for many reasons, I would say, because these gardens were being, first off, there was an expectation of labor that would take place by Indigenous folks with no consultation as to whether that labor should actually be taking place or whether folks would like to be doing that labor. And then we also had these dynamics between folks who were previously in the gardens, who were in many cases settlers or recent immigrants or migrants. And then there was this interaction with Indigenous folks, which there was no mediation there. And it really felt like this very disturbing kind of recolonization experience for a lot of folks. And so I think this is just to speak to the fact that in this you know, in these gardens, they're complicated. It's very messy. The realities are very messy, and it can be so hard to capture that messiness. And they can be, in some cases, have quite detrimental effects, you know. And so often I spoke to the beautiful relational aspects, but it's important to speak to the other aspects of them. So I would say when I first saw, when I first saw Bavia's comment or question, or I wanted to speak to kind of my own sort of experience of self-transformation in these gardens, because I think that even though I've worked in these spaces for a while, I was, you know, at a time in my life where I wasn't doing well in my health when I started this research, and I found the gardens actually extremely beneficial for me being back in those spaces. And I really experienced on my own self, like the kind of the healing aspect of the gardens, but that was simultaneously going on with seeing other folks not experience the healing aspect of gardens. So that's all over the place. But just to say, there really is so much unlearning, so much learning that takes place in these spaces, so many, you know, I think so much that we have to tend to, and so much where the relationship with the more than human can sometimes be clouded by the purely social relationships that take place, which can be quite complex. So anyway.
Yeah, so I think a really nice thing about your comments, Jane, now, and Bobby's comment as well, is just that it reminds us that this idea of remaking is really fundamental in diverse economies theory, and that there is an opportunity to work on these interventions in terms of our relationships with earthkin and within ourselves as much as in the communities where we're working, and that we can take this sort of we can work on ourselves as that kind of meeting point between the scholarly work that we do and the interventions where we are practicing, engaging, meeting. And I see a bunch of stuff is jumping into the chat, probably because people are recognizing that it's about time to go. So I think, yeah, Ava, I'm trying to sort of scan your comment there about feeling like the temporal dimensions of this work and the sort of pressures that we're under with all this sort of language of crisis that is constantly surrounding us. I wonder if anyone has any last words or sort of quick comments that they feel a burning need to get out. I just want to say thanks, Ethan, for giving me some like words to add to my life. I like this cultural invention as a sort of a different way of thinking about like the sort of more standard like knowledge production, because it is kind of this constant gap that we're supposed to be filling these gaps in knowledge, right? But it is kind of this like cultural invention, or like that constrains and interacts with this cultural restoration idea, especially because related to your comment, Ignacio, like restoration is then constrained to the sort of Western meaning and intervention of it in many contexts. So, you know, what restoration looks like in the eyes of the different sort of people that are listening to it. So, did you have a last comment? I see you unmuted, Ignacio.
Oh, no, just to thank you all. Very interesting conversation.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. And great talk. This is a recorded session, and we're taking a screen, the chat as well will be recorded for posterity. Thank you, Carlotta, for organizing us.
Thank you, everyone, for coming along and generating such interesting discussions. It was great.
Yeah. Well,
yeah, I'll be sharing the chat. I'll be sharing the chat with everyone.
Nice. Yeah, and remember, all these videos are available to watch and review at your leisure. So enjoy the rest of your days, however long they may be.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Hey, great work, Carlotta. Great work.